At my husband's funeral, my son hung my photo at the entrance with the caption, "No entry," but he didn't realize. I stood on the steps of the small funeral chapel, the Arizona sun beating down on the polished wood door, where my own face watched me from a framed photograph hung next to the sign that screamed, "No entry," in bold black letters. My son Brandon's voice echoed inside my mind. "She steps inside. She walks through that doorway. I will call the police immediately." The words sliced into me like a blade, but I did not flinch. I still held my back straight, though I felt smaller than a sparrow. I carried with both hands a simple bouquet of white carnations my neighbor had given me. She still believed I needed beauty in that moment. They weighed heavy in my arms. Behind me, the gravel crunched as relatives whispered and laughed behind folded hands. That old lady once canceled her daughter-in-law's nail appointment because she said it was a waste of money, someone snorted. Of course she would sabotage family joy, another woman whispered with a smirk. Every word, every glance told me I had already been exiled twice over. First by fortune, now by family. I glanced up at the chapel entrance. The wreaths and wreath stands that lined the walkway were arranged by family members who acted as if they had never loved me. My son had insisted on blue ribbons and glass-etched sympathy cards he paid with the inheritance he could recite in dollar signs as if memorized scripture. He looked at me the other day and said, "Mom, I want to keep your part of the money separate. It is not for you. Which is for a souvenir." I swallowed hard. I'd left whatever vanity I still had upstairs by the cracked window where the breeze carried dust through the lace curtain. Now all I carried was that bouquet and my memories of a man who had once kissed me as though I saved him by breathing. I raised my head and touched the side of the chapel doorway, secondhand wood sending a tremor through my fingertips. I remembered when I had helped choose that chapel for its quiet dignity, when all those years ago he was alive, strong, humming old folk songs, asking me to wait in the passenger seat while he parked the car. He always found a place for me. Now even the stones pushed me out. A distant aunt turned and clasped her hands around her pearl necklace, like she had caught me trespassing. A cousin huffed, "Do you think she even knows what she is doing here?" I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing in the desert air, dry, harsh, honest. I remembered his belt buckle, polished to a shine, how he said, "Those who wear medals did not win blood, it was the others who paid for us." Then the cough came. He survived, but barely. I sold his Purple Heart because he needed an ambulance. We needed medicine. I couldn't live with the guilt of watching him die without trying. So yes, I sold his medal, but not for vanity or for myself. I sold it because my heart could not bear his disappearance. Yet they said I did it for myself. They said I did it for comfort. They said I was selfish. They said I was worthless. A distant relative shouted from inside, "Who let the intruder in? That woman belongs on a bench at the diner, not at a funeral." My heart twisted, but I did not step back. The flowers in my hands trembled, petals ready to fall. I thought, maybe I should run, melt into the Arizona heat, become nothing. But then I heard a steady footstep behind me. I turned to see an older man in a worn military uniform, the man from my husband's platoon. We fought side by side decades ago, when I was still Michelle, the young wife waiting with letters and patched clothes. At his chest was the ribbon of the same Purple Heart I had sold. In his hands was a polished wooden box. He stepped forward and said quietly, "Michelle, he would want this returned to you." He placed the box on a small folding chair set in the shade of a mesquite branch. I stared at it. Inside was the medal, the Purple Heart I sold, and on the inside of the lid was a letter in my husband's shaky handwriting. "Michelle, you are the real medal. Without you, I never survived. This is yours always and beyond." My breath hitched. I stared at the words, read and reread until the parking lot dust settled over my vision. Inside the chapel was beginning the somber notes of the funeral service. I could faintly hear the minister say, "We gather to honor the life of a beloved husband, a veteran, and a father." And there I was, standing outside, holding his words, his truth, and his greatest honor, returned not in a court document, not in my son's arrogance, but by a comrade who remembered. My tears were steady, not for myself, but for the injustice of being judged when I had only tried to save the man I loved. I stepped forward now, unlocked by that truth, from the scorching steps into the chapel. The "no entry" sign looked small, ridiculous. I slipped past it, silent but invincible. The door closed behind me, not with shame, but with recognition that this place was always mine. I remember the day he told me he had been seeing someone else. We were sitting in the living room, where the pale light filtered through lace curtains and dust settled like memory. I had been folding Brandon's laundry, his first pair of khakis that he had worn to kindergarten, full of grass stains and crayon scribbles. He came in and sat across from me, eyes tired, and said, "I did not mean for it to happen, Michelle, but I have been seeing her." My hands slowed, the warmth drained out of me, and I felt as though a lock clicked shut inside my chest. The words themselves would not kill me, but the realization that I was not enough to keep him from walking away with someone else bruised me deeper than any blow could. Yet when Brandon's baby face peeked around the corner, calling for Daddy, I forced my shoulders to stand straight and smiled. I stayed because Brandon needed a father in his life, and I could not bear to be the cause of his father fleeing entirely. Night after night I lay awake, listening to the creak of the floor as he went out to meet her, the silence of our bedroom thicker than any fabric. I taught myself to breathe quietly so as not to wake the child who believed in love but had seen too much of it crumble. I told myself, I stay so he has a father. I stay so that the house feels whole when Brandon walks through the door. I stay because even a broken family is better than none. Then came the heart attack. I found him on the kitchen floor next to the coffee pot, hand bleeding, his face ashen. I called an ambulance with trembling hands and held his head in my lap in the hospital where the white walls hummed with antiseptic regret. The doctors said he was lucky to be alive, that the stroke nearly cost him his life. The bills piled up faster than the tears I did not cry in front of Brandon. I had a savings account, just a small one. Brandon's college fund was just small and raw in my purse, and I could not ruin his future for his father's illness. I sold the Purple Heart he had received overseas, mounted in a small case, after the doctors said he might not survive. I told myself I was doing it so the man who once held me in his arms would continue to breathe. I was saving the person I had once loved so deeply that forgetting him was not an option. I watched from the hospital corridor as paramedics wheeled him away, telling me they would do everything they could, and I thought, I sold his medal not because I no longer valued it, but because it meant less than his next heartbeat. When I brought home enough money to cover the costs, I returned from the pawn shop with a letter instead of the medal. They had sold it to a collector who did not want to return it. I cried in the bedroom, pressed the letter between my hands. We are sorry, cannot return, spent. Even that apology cut me. I tucked it away in a drawer. I told the doctor's office I would cover what remained when I could, and I said a silent prayer that the compassion I gave when I stayed would be returned to me someday. Brandon grew into a young man with sharp eyes and sharper words. He blamed me for everything. If you had left, Dad would have met someone better, he said once, when he was 15 and found his textbooks overdue. He accused me of keeping him in emotional debt, of making him choose between a family reputation and the truth. You chose loyalty so you could feel like a martyr, he snarled. I nodded and let him go. I stayed because that child still needed me to hold him through the storms of adolescence. I remember him telling his friends about me, how I was the woman who canceled his coupons because I was stingy, how I would declutter his childhood with labeled boxes and budgets and lessons in thrift. They laughed, thinking I was a villain in a tale of domestic disdain. When I visited his college dorm to drop off bread and peanut butter during finals week, he texted me the next day. Stop sending me food. I do not need a mother. I have friends. I stopped sending food. But I cried when I heard his roommate say, You are lucky your mom cares. Some of us eat ramen every night. Every memory burned me. The prom night I drove him so he would not be stranded. The awards ceremony where he glowed and I clapped louder than anyone else. The science fair when my camera jammed and I still managed to catch that photo of him standing proud beside his volcano model. I taped that photo to the fridge, its tape curling with time, even after he moved out and college bills consumed the rest of my living expenses. Years later, After the funeral, people in the neighborhood told me how they saw him signing papers, how he looked over his shoulder before leaving the house I had once called our home. He was living with his girlfriend now, the same one he told me about so many years ago. They had been seen choosing paint colors for a nursery. I felt nothing. I remembered the night he was born, quiet and perfect, and the day he flew away, bursting with ambition, and I whispered to the night sky, "I did this so you would fly, not so you would cut ties." In the end, I was the woman who carried 2 broken hearts in her arms, his originally, then mine. I sold the metal, not for comfort, but because sometimes love demands giving away the symbols of sacrifice for the sake of another life. I stayed not because I had to, but because loyalty is sometimes the loneliest place of all. I arrived at the chapel doors, clutching my coat tightly around me as though it were a fragile shield, the air inside heavy with mirrored chandeliers and muffled voices. As I stepped forward, a uniformed attendant blocked the entrance without a word. His stern face softened only momentarily. When he saw my trembling hands holding that small bouquet, I opened my mouth to say something gentle, something about my husband, but the words were snatched away by the collapsing hush around me. Brandon emerged from behind the closed doors, his posture rigid, eyes burning with contempt. He spoke into the silence like a prosecutor. She sold Dad's Purple Heart just to buy anti-anxiety medication for herself. The words spread through the chapel like spilled ink, staining the air in ways I could no longer ignore. I felt a swirl of motion behind me. Recognizable faces blurred. Friends of my husband, cousins whose names I could once recite, neighbors who had once offered casseroles, rising from their chairs. They exchanged glances before filing past me toward the front pews. I stood still, their movement like a wave of indifference crashing across the chapel floor. One of my husband's old fishing buddies tapped Brandon lightly on the shoulder and whispered. I heard, though I did not see. She did it to save him. We know. But no one intervened, and no apology rose in the air. I swallowed slowly, tasting the bitterness of being erased in front of people who once fed my pride. Update. I took another breath and saw my husband's fishing partner step closer to the attendant, leaning down with a quiet urgency. The man's face clouded with something like regret. I knitted my fingers tighter around the flowers. I had not come here for forgiveness, but to stand witness to truth, not lies. My legs folded into themselves when I noticed Dylan, my neighbor, showing the security guard a few wrinkled bills, enough to pay for the coffin and more. Then the guard simply stepped aside. The shift was slight, but to me it broke chains. Brandon's voice was gone. The room paused around its echo. I inhaled and walked forward, each step a thunderous drum, but toward the threshold of entry. Once inside, the chapel felt small, suffocating, and all the forged respect I once earned seemed to evaporate. I could see the collar of the pastor's robe, the stained glass reflections on the casket, and I thought, is this where I belong? I had carried his dreams across decades, and the honor of those years was evaporating under the accusation that I had sold a symbol of valor for pills. Then Brandon stood at the front with his wife, her eyes filled with performance, not grief. He cleared his throat and added for effect, "Feel free to take a seat, but outside." The room stiffened, the guests in the back rearranged, shifting into solid bodies between me and the front pews. I felt my bones fold into calm. I did not speak. I only placed the carnation bouquet on a small table, next to a framed photo of my husband, smiling, alive, before illness stole him. A sob escaped my throat. Not mine. The pastor cleared his throat. Let us pray. The candles trembled. I bowed my head and let the silence fill me. Outside the chapel, someone murmured, "What a disgrace." I thought, disgrace is defined by own hearts. I did not leave during the prayer. I stayed until it ended, when the air cracked with soft hallelujahs and the mourners stepped forward. Some patted me on the shoulder, others did not make eye contact. I rose, shoulders square. I carried that stillness out with me like a banner. Outside the chapel, the sun was harsh again. The pavement glowed. Brandon's hand slipped from his wife's grip, and he leaned over to whisper, "She does not deserve anything." His voice echoed in the sunlit dale. I exhaled, long and slow. It did not sting, it cleansed. I turned away from him, from the chapel, from the eyes that had judged me. I walked to the edge of the parking lot where my car waited and placed a hand on its cool hood. I looked once more at the chapel door, at the faces inside, and then turned. I left them behind. I stood just outside the chapel doors, palms pressed against the painted white frame as though I could feel every sorrow etched onto the surface. I thought I had no right to be here. I had sold his Purple Heart, sold it to pay for the ambulance, to keep my husband alive when a stroke nearly claimed him. But right then, when I had steeled myself to bow out of their presence, I saw him appear. Raymond Ellis, his army jacket still covered in stripes and pins, and a small wooden box carefully cupped in both weathered hands. He moved like a soldier whose mission had finally ended, not with death, but with an act of honor restored. I heard no applause, the world waiting with bated breath as he approached. When he reached me, I swallowed the bitter ache of shame and lifted my eyes. He did not pretend he did not know what I had done. He said, softly, "Michelle, you sold his medal to save his breath. I knew how much he meant to you. I just want you to have it again." He placed the box on the ground. My breath caught when I saw the brass corner inlay, the grain of the wood polished to a glow. He opened it, and there, nestled between royal blue satin, lay the Purple Heart, tarnished at the edges, but still glinting with past courage. Beside it was a folded piece of lined paper, neatly written in a shaky hand. I picked it up with trembling fingers, already knowing what it said. "Michelle," I whispered, voice small. "How?" He stood back, rigid, tears in his eyes. "He wanted you to have it. He always thought you deserved it more than he ever did." I unfolded the letter, and in my friend's voice I heard my husband's echo. "Michelle, you are my true medal. In war I shot at enemies, but my greatest battle was living without your support. You are not less than me. Give your heart to the world. It is stronger than mine ever was." I pressed the letter to my chest, my body folding into the weight of love, sacrifice, regret, and redemption. A car backfired. The canvas of the world shivered at that moment, as if something ancient and true had roared back to life. Inside, I could hear Brandon cough. I turned and looked at him, his face ashen, eyes red with midnight tiredness. No one else was watching. They had all scattered when Raymond entered, too stunned to remain curious. I knelt, gathering the Purple Heart and the letter together. They felt heavy and holy in my lap. "Put the bouquet down," Raymond said gently. I did, and he took my arm and led me inside. The guard parted like a sea for someone important, not because of politics, but because of character, regained. We walked through the chapel hush. The minister paused mid-prayer, his eyes following us. I thought I would cry, but every drop of tears had already fallen where they needed to, inside the box, inside my heart, beside my husband's name on that paper. Raymond whispered over my shoulder. He asked me to bring it back here if you ever needed it. I walked to the front, the aisle thick with the smell of lilies and cedar, and placed the box on the same table where the flowers stood. The photograph of my husband looked almost triumphant by comparison, not because the military had honored him again, but because the woman he loved had found closure for him and for herself. When Brandon stood when he saw me walk in, confusion flashed across his face like lightning. He wanted to say something, but I raised a hand. I did not need to speak. The medal spoke. The letter spoke. Every person there knew he had tried to erase me, but now everything had turned. Raymond took his seat. I knelt in front of the box and read the letter out loud in a voice only they could hear. "You are my true medal." And I meant it more than words can ever carry. Then I turned toward Brandon and held the medal in both hands. His shoulders fell, as if he carried them for the longest time and finally let go. No one applauded. Some exhaled, but then people began to come forward. Cousins, neighbors, even a few friends of Brandon, who remembered how I once baked cookies after broken bones, sat in waiting rooms after car crashes, listened when nobody else did. One by one, they bowed their heads or offered their hands, not to honor me for what I had done, but for what I had not stopped doing. For love stronger than shame, for sacrifice greater than resentment, for loyalty that never died. I held the medal pressed against my heart, even after everyone had gone silent again. I thought, this is how forgiveness begins, not with forgetting, but with proof of love restored. That evening, as I stepped outside, the sky had turned amber. The air smelled of rain and dust, the desert holding on to the day's heat. Raymond walked beside me, and I asked quietly, "Will you walk me home?" He nodded, and we walked in companionable silence through the chapel grounds, where magnolia petals lay like notes of memory. Brandon sat in his car watching as we passed. I did not see anger in his eyes anymore. I saw loss, I saw regret, but most of all I saw the truth, that love survives when courage finds its voice. Then I looked at the medal in my hand. It was not the end of anything, it was beginning again. I stepped. Through the chapel doors into a world I barely recognized. Bright lights, solemn rows of seated faces, flashes of cameras, and a hush like drawn curtains. The room smelled of lilies and wood polish, of mourning mixed with something sharper. Anticipation. Brandon stood at the front, next to the coffin that bore his father's folded flag. He held a remote device, thumb hovering over it, with a look that said he was about to break open the final chapter of our lives. My heart hammered as he pressed play. The screen behind the pastor flickered and came alive with a video. My husband, pale and weak, clutching the same medal I returned and holding a letter in his trembling hand. His voice came softly, full of both resolve and sorrow. "Michelle, you were my strength when my body failed. I am leaving everything I own to the only person who never gave up on me. Michelle, this house, our savings, every share, all belongs to her. Brandon will receive $1, and only $1. If he ever kneels and publicly apologizes to Michelle, kneels and asks for forgiveness in front of our family and those who care, then I will consider allowing him a modest share. But until that moment, Michelle is the one who will carry forward our legacy." The room erupted. I felt the box containing the medal drop from my hands, metal clinking against wood and satin, but I did not bend to pick it up. Brandon froze, his face draining. Reporters raised cameras. The clicks and whispers surged, like waves crashing at the edges of grief and justice. I stood small over the box, feeling its weight against the swell of truth. Brandon's knees collapsed into wood. A single sunflower, crushed and forgotten, lay on the chapel floor, my silent message of forgiveness in petals. In that moment, as Brandon knelt, I understood that what we dismiss as broken can hold the most dignity. He plopped down on his own suit jacket, head hitting the pew, hands braced on the seat before him. Someone gasped, "He's kneeling to his mother." A hush followed as the words echoed. No one expected public admission. The condition was not buried in fine print. They said they signed for love, not legal battles, but love, it seemed, could still demand accountability. Brandon murmured through tears, I never meant." His voice cracked so hard even his fiancée turned away. I stood there, immobile, watching the man who called me parasite, who hung no entry above my face, kneel at my feet as if nothing had sunk him lower than denying me. Not humiliated, that word is not enough. He was broken. But I did not gloat. I simply watched, because grief does not need name-calling to be effective. Outside, social media erupted. Phones everywhere streamed the moment live. Feed after feed carried headlines like, "Son who banned mother from funeral now kneels before her in tears." Comments poured in. "Karma's a desert wind. Memories but no mercy backfires. Justice wears lilies." Even news anchors replayed the moment with complete silence, letting images do the talking. Ministers cleared their throats. Meek hands passed tissues to him. I felt a weird relief, the kind that blooms when truth finally moves. I looked down at Caleb, that toddler from the photo just days ago. He stared at Brandon, eyebrows knitted, confusion creasing his forehead, as if watching someone unravel too fast to catch. I bent to scoop up the medal and the letter. Brandon lifted his head when I passed by and caught the note. "Michelle is stronger than my mistakes." I paused and our eyes met. He flinched as if ashamed to see what he had denied. Outside, cameras followed me. Reporters called my name like a benediction. I didn't run. I walked, chest lifted, measured steps. Every eye met mine, not with judgment, but with the kind of recognition that cannot be earned with excuses. In the afternoon sun, I slipped on my coat and slipped outside, past the crowd that had once turned their backs. past Brandon, who watched me go. The door closed with a finality that sounded like forgiveness. For him, for me, for the man lying in the chapel. I sank into my car, metal in letter resting on the dashboard. "You were right," I whispered to this silence. "Love outlives betrayal." And as I drove home, the desert lights blooming through windshield at dusk, I felt it. Justice had not roared, it had walked at its own pace, and finally arrived. I drove north from Phoenix through shifting pinyon pines until the air grew cooler and thinner, their scent like memory rising behind me. Here in the high desert beyond Flagstaff, I found a small house, a modest wood-paneled cottage with a porch swing that creaked rhythmically in the mountain breeze. I placed the Purple Heart and the letter from my husband on the mantel, where they caught the flame from a lone saguaro candle, dripping wax onto weathered brick. I did not ask for peace, but I needed silence. This place offered space between the heartbeats of my past and whatever future I would allow myself to pursue. A week later, a knock came on the door. I opened it to find the editor of the local paper on the stoop, a tall woman with warm gray eyes and steady hands. She introduced herself and said, "I'd been watching your story. We'd be honored if you would write a column for our readers. Call it A Word from the Mother They Turned Away." Her words sent a tremor through me. I had expected whispers or pity, not an audience that would hear me. I nodded and she stepped back, leaving me with a business card and a future I never believed I deserved. I sat at my kitchen table, drafting that first piece, titled Silence and Forgiveness. I wrote about the silence I carried after 20 years of trying to hold a broken home together. I wrote about forgiveness, not as a gift to them, but as a lifeline to myself. I closed with, "I stayed because love does not always end in gratitude, but sometimes it demands its own freedom." I sent it in, hands trembling, uncertain and certain all at once. The next morning, I found the paper on my doorstep. My column spanned the entire opinion page. Beneath it was a quiet editorial note. "Michelle's words are a testament to endurance we all need to read." I stared at the column as though it were a photograph, wondering if it was someone else's truth. Within days, emails arrived. A former neighbor typed through tears, saying she had never understood what I endured. A young mother in a shelter wrote, "Your article gave me courage." On the community forum, someone posted, "That column broke something inside me and rebuilt it." I had not expected leaders to celebrate a woman who endured, but a quiet revolution was unfolding. Then came the in-person visits. A store owner brought a loaf of freshly baked bread and said, "Your column saved my marriage today." A retired schoolteacher pressed a flower into my hand, tears in her eyes. I knew war. I knew love. Now I know peace. Their voices formed a chorus, not of blame but recognition, human dignity remembered. One evening, as sunset draped the sky in rose and gold, I stepped onto the porch, swinging gently. I looked at the candle melting quietly in the window. The Purple Heart gleamed. I thought of how many times I bent so our family would stand, and now here, in the mountains, the silence I asked for became the voice I needed. A few weeks later, a paper ran a special feature, photographed me at my table, hands folded, expression calm, titled, "Michelle, a Beacon of Human Strength." I felt exposed and honored. No more orchestrated perfection, just the quiet aftermath of what sacrifice can become, someone's quiet love made visible. At the end of summer, I received an invitation from the school board to speak at their kickoff assembly. They wanted the children to hear about resilience. I stood before third graders in a crowded gym, knees shaking. I told them simply, bravery is not loud. Sometimes bravery is choosing hope after everything breaks. They clapped so soft, so honest, I carried that sound home with me. Brandon did not come back. The house on the hill sat empty. His inheritance flickered into something empty. But the world I built in Flagstaff thrived with quiet voices, neighbors greeting me at the farmer's market, the librarian recommending books I had written by accident with my words on the page, the mountain wind carrying a sense that life, even at the end, can rise again. I realized then that my inheritance was not measured in property or pennies. It was measured by the soft illumination of words that outlived despair. So now, when I look at that Purple Heart and the letter on my mantle, I see two truths. The metal is just metal, but the love that brought me to this moment is indelible. And as I rock gently on the swing, twilight folding around me, I say into that silence, you cannot break a spirit that has chosen to rise. I settled into life in Flagstaff as though I were learning a new breath, a slower, deeper kind that only mountain air knows. The days stretched wide, quiet spaces opening doorways to memories I had long tucked away. I spent mornings sipping tea on the porch swing, watching the sun crawl across granite and juniper. But there was a loneliness in peace when it had no purpose, waiting to be softened by connection. One afternoon, I wandered into the local assisted living community just to retrieve some ingredients I had dropped off earlier, then lingered by a window where an elderly woman sat alone, tracing lines in a sketchbook with a faded pencil. Her name was Ruth, and something in the gentleness of her hands called to me. I introduced myself and asked if I might sit. She did not look up, but she nodded gently. Then she handed me the pencil, and as though we had spoken for lifetimes, I sat down beside her and began to draw mountains, the same ones I gazed at through my window. The rasp in her voice when she finally spoke sounded like a violin, thin yet unwavering. Colors bring back memories I thought I lost, she said, and I knew then that I had found a companion who understood the ache of memory and the quiet strength of drawing them back into life. We began meeting every week. On Tuesdays I brought pastel chalks and sketchbooks. She brought stories. One day she fashioned a canvas from an old t-shirt, painting silhouettes of the life that had once been hers, grandchildren, dances, long summers, and smiled when she folded it. So, you remember that summer too? I did. I remembered even the smell of her lavender soap. We decided, almost without speaking, that those afternoons should become more than our therapy. We proposed an art group for other residents, people who were often overlooked as shadows, simply waiting. We called it Living Lines. I asked permission from the facility director, who hesitated. Do you think they will want to do art? She asked. I said, art does not ask permission, it simply waits for us. The director watched Ruth sketch a hummingbird, her hands steady and sure. She nodded once. That was all the permission we needed. In the first week, 10 people attended. Some held their brushes like they had forgotten how. Others, hands spotted with Parkinson's, pressed crayons too hard or too soft, but they painted. They painted tulips, stories, tears, laughter. I watched Dorothy, who had not spoken much since her husband died, draw a child holding her hand. She sat back and said softly, I remember her hair. The room cleared of posture. The tension lifted. I thought, that afternoon, this is why we were given hands that tremble. They bring innocence back. We invited local artists to join us, a sculptor who taught clay bowls, a musician who brought a guitar, and asked them to trace the curve of each string with their fingertips before strumming. Creativity swelled like a fountain through the space. The art teacher whispered to me one day, they are remembering the parts of themselves they thought gone. That word, remember, became our quiet anthem. The health benefits appeared almost too gentle to notice at first. Maggie, who had declined every invitation to lunch for months, began joining us afterward. She said her appetite returned with each brush stroke. Albert, who had forgotten his granddaughter's face, started painting wildflowers, smiling when he recognized dads and birthdays in the petals. His daughter brought a photograph matching his painting. He looked at it and for the first time in years said, "That's my girl." Researchers say art therapy helps with cognitive function, emotional healing, social connection. And those were not abstractions here. They were brush marks, laughter, ceremony. Our class defied definitions because it was just people making beauty when they thought they had nothing left to give. One day, the local paper cupper showed our class in progress, pastel dust on faces and canvas, title across the photo, "Art restores what life took away." Later papers ran quotes, "Color shook my grief." We are not forgotten. The words filled me with something stronger than pride. They held the truth of what I had discovered. Silence is not an end, it is a beginning when someone sees you. When I looked back at the mountains from our front porch, I no longer saw peace as stillness. I saw it as movement, creation made from survival. I thought of my column, Silence and Forgiveness, and these canvases painted by withered hands. They were made of memory, hope, resilience. I thought of all the mothers who stayed quiet and all the stories they held. Their voices still echoed in candlelight and chalk lines. And now ours spoke, in watercolor and pastel, voice in chorus, The walls needed them, not as art, but reclamation. As winter tipped into snow, I packed away my husband's letter, placing it inside the cover of a community art journal where volunteers wrote back, "Your writing saved my soul." I closed the pages and touched the cover, feeling the texture of words not erased. One evening, Ruth and I sat by the fire. I said, "We gave them more than art." She nodded. "We gave them breath." I thought of the message I had carried through every step. Silence is not weakness. Cruelty demands consequence. Harmony comes when truth speaks. I whispered into the flames that were bathed in early starlight. People may forget sacrifice, but justice never forgets. And under that vast sky, with brush and word and heart, it felt true as sunrise. Score, if this story touched your heart, if Michelle's quiet strength and journey toward dignity made you feel something powerful, then do not keep it to yourself. Leave a comment below. Have you or someone you know ever been underestimated, only to rise stronger than ever? And most importantly, subscribe to Grandma True Stories, because every wrinkle carries a war, every silence hides a story, and every grandmother deserves to be heard. Until next time, remember, kindness is louder than cruelty, and truth always finds its voice.